Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Abigail, and welcome to this week's Zion Tabernacle of Greater Austin, Texas Shabbat meeting. To begin, our brother Richard is going to begin the meeting now with a prayer.
Holy Father, we just love you. We love your commands. We love your Torah. We love the assembly. We love the remnant, and you're calling them. And Father, it's no different tonight. We want your word to go to the ends of the earth. We want your people to receive, to hear, be glad, have hope, and to covenant with you totally. So just bless this meeting and let all things go smoothly, Lord. And we pray this in Yeshua's name.
And now for a special message with Eliyahu ben David.
Welcome, friends. Great to have you with us once again. And we're continuing our remastered video series, Restoring the Assembly. And I think we've had some exciting videos already to share with you as we premiere this series. And tonight, we're moving on to Paul, never part of the Christian church. And we put out that video knowing there's a lot of people who would not even be able to watch it because of the title. The title would scare them away just so severely they wouldn't watch it. And that would be a shame if that happened, because there's a lot in this video that could be very, very helpful to people who are Christians or have been part of some Christian church or organization. And it's very enlightening to find out the truth about Paul and the rest of what we have in this video. So we want to invite you all now to watch this remastered video, Paul, never part of the Christian church. If you take a look at the slide I'm showing right now, it might seem kind of strange to you. Maybe not, because you might be a little more advanced in your understanding. But to many people, it would look quite ridiculous to even suggest that the Christian church did not exist before 135 AD. And many people would reject that idea out of hand. And really, for us to suggest this, some people might be insulted. They might be thinking we're saying, well, if you're a Christian, you're not really saved. Or they might extrapolate what we're saying to mean something different than simply that we're talking about history here. So, in talking about this, we're not attacking Christians. We're not telling you you're not saved if you are a Christian. We simply are talking about history. Well, why are we doing that? Because we want to know how things really happened. It's as simple as that. You know, history gets changed a lot. Now, I'll give you an example of how this happens. In the summer of 2015, the Supreme Court changed the definition of a word that has meant a certain thing for 6,000 years. That word is marriage. And it always meant, from the book of Genesis forward, the union of a man and a woman together. in matrimony. However, the Supreme Court changed the definition of the word so that now it can mean the union of people of the same sex. So 100 years from now, were Messiah not to return before then, which he will, when people heard the word marriage, what would they think that meant? You see, the word would be changed in their mind, wouldn't it? And then when they read about people being married, for instance, in the scriptures, they're thinking that word includes things that really the word in the scriptures does not include. Well, changing words, changing the perception of history, this serves the benefit of certain groups who want to convince people of certain things. And so actually, the idea of things that we accept as history being different than the way that we've always thought about them really is not that strange if you think about it. And to go back and know what the truth is sets us free from deceptions and helps us know what is really going on. So that's what we're talking about here. You know, I think this particular subject is a lot like that story of the emperor's new clothes, where basically in that story, if you've read it, the emperor is purported to be wearing new clothes, but only the enlightened elite people can see the clothes. So when people see the emperor, and even the emperor himself, and he's completely naked, they all agree that his new clothes look fantastic, because none of them want to look stupid. And they all think, well, the smart people think this. The smart people see the clothes. I want to be one of the smart people, so I'm going to agree with it too. Well, tonight, who I am is I'm the little kid that's saying, hey, wait a minute. The emperor's not wearing any clothes. That's basically it on this. So let's take a look at this now. We're talking about the Christian church system. And it did not exist before 135 AD. And not only that, but the Christian church is not built on the foundation of the apostles at all, since it came later. Now, you might be wondering, you might be thinking, that can't be true, because in the New Testament, we read about the apostles, we read all about the message. Yeah, we really do. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is the fact that that is a completely different group of people than the Gentile Christian Church. And we're going to look at documents that are going to help to prove that are going to basically show you that the emperor is wearing no clothes. Well, as we look at this, let's start with Peter. Now, as you look at this picture, you really think Peter looked anything like that? You know, Peter was a Jewish fisherman. Do you have a recollection of any fisherman you've ever seen wearing gaudy jewels and royal clothing? Perhaps holding a golden key? Is that what a fisherman looks like? No, what you're looking at in this picture is revisionist history, isn't it? This is the Catholic Peter, not the biblical Peter. And the Catholic Peter, we're told, was the first pope. And really, In that economy, the Catholic Church has an unbroken succession, apostolic succession from Peter forward. There are some problems with that, though. Paul says that Peter had a mission, an apostleship to the Jews. Not to everybody, to the Jews. And not only that, scholars recognize that James was the leader of that early group, not Peter. In fact, there is no claim in the New Testament or anywhere that Peter was ever even in Rome, not until you get to dubious writers from the middle of the 2nd century or later. So think about this. During Peter's lifetime, from that period, and the lifetime of people following Peter, nobody says that Peter was ever in Rome. It's only later, when it served the purpose of trying to sustain this idea that Peter was the first pope, that anybody actually ever said this. Well, if Peter did not supply the apostolic authority for the Christian church, some others might say, well, actually, it was Paul that did that. Paul was the one that brought Christianity to the Gentiles. Well, what about that? What about Paul? Was Paul really the first Christian? In fact, we ask the question here, was Paul a Jew or a Christian? Well, a lot of people would assume Paul was a Christian, right? Isn't that what you think? Or thought at one time? Well, as we look more closely in the New Testament, in Acts 13:9, we have his actual name, Saul, in other words, the Hebrew Shaul, who is called Paul. So what was his actual name, Saul or Paul? Paul was just a nickname. Shaul was his real name. And the scripture doesn't even tell us that the name Paul came from God or Messiah. It was just a nickname. So his actual name was a Hebrew name, Shaul. As we read more in the New Testament, we find that Saul never says, I'm a Christian. He always says that he's a Jew. And there's numerous verses where he claims to be a Jew. In 2 Timothy, it says that he worshiped as his forefathers did. Again, claiming to be an Israelite. As we go through the book of Acts, we find him regularly attending not the basilica or the church building, but the synagogue. The book of Acts tells us that he believed the Torah and the prophets. And it even says that he kept the Torah. He taught those of both Jewish and Gentile ethnicity to keep the commandments. All of this is in the New Testament. You can look up the verses. Paul, in his work, never dreamed of the idea that he was starting a new religion. You can look at these verses, Romans 11, Ephesians 2, and many other places. He was advocating entry into renewed Israel through faith in Israel's Messiah. not starting a new religion. That's why the Jewish religious leaders were angry with Paul, because they saw him as the leader of a competing Jewish sect, which was called by them the sect of the Nazarenes. In fact, this term Nazarenes or Nazareans is applied to the same group of people, not just in the first century, but for many centuries, several centuries, at least all the way into the 4th century. These Nazareans did not conceive of themselves as part of the Christian church. They conceived of themselves as part of renewed Israel. Well, here is a recent book. It's written by a Bible scholar, 4 Bible scholars. It's entitled Paul Within Judaism. And the description of the book says, in these chapters, a group of renowned international scholars seek to describe Paul and his work from within Judaism. This is how scholars see Paul within Judaism. A review there at Amazon says, Paul, as a Second Temple Jew, did not see himself as creating a new religion. Why is there such a big disconnect between what the apostles are said to have represented and what they really did represent? And especially regarding Paul. How come the lay people in the Christian church are given to believe that Paul spread Christianity, while the scholars know that that really isn't true, that he was not creating a new religion, and that he was a Messianic Jew? Do you know that the scholars have been talking about this among themselves, have been writing books about this for one another for over 30 years? And still, in the pews, in the churches, in popular books and material that are written for the lay level, Paul is continued to be represented as spreading Christianity. I ask you, is it really honest for the scholars to know this, but not to tell the people this? At any rate, the truth is, we cannot look to Paul as the source of the Christian church. You can't find anyone, actually, in the New Testament that you can point to that actually created the separate entity from Israel, which we refer to as the Christian church. Well, this is the claimed link between the apostles and the Christian church. This is what apostolic succession hangs on. You probably have heard about the church fathers, haven't you? Maybe you've read some of that material. But you know, the truth is, most of us haven't. We just assume that there's this historical information from people back in the first few centuries that established this history of the Christian church. Actually, when you look at the name of this group, the Apostolic Fathers, That would suggest to you that they're connected with the apostles, right? And then we have the list. These are the sources that are agreed by virtually all scholars to be a part of the apostolic fathers. There are some other sources from this same period. Now, this is the end of the first century and the first half of the second century, essentially the generation following and overlapping with the apostles. And there are a few other writings that purport to be from this time, but these are the ones that are agreed upon as being a part of this witness to the Christian church as the apostolic fathers. And really, this is all they've got to try and connect the Christian church to the first century apostles. We're going to look at each of these sources briefly, and we're going to see if they actually do connect the Christian church to the apostles. Now, you might be looking at this right now and thinking, if you're a Christian, well, the apostolic fathers, this is going to prove this guy wrong. This has to show there's a connection between the Christian church and the apostles. They're called the apostolic fathers. Well, don't get your hopes up too much. Here's what one scholar who is actually teaching these books has to say. The term apostolic fathers is applied to the writings of the late first and early second century and might be construed to imply that the so-called fathers were men who had actually known the apostles personally and therefore represented the first generation of post-apostolic leadership in the church. You know why it might be construed that that's the case? Why you might believe that? Well, why are they called the apostolic fathers? Isn't it to imply that? And not only that, it's very possible if you are sitting in a pew in church, they're going to mention the apostolic fathers as being this connection. However, this particular man cannot say that to you here because this is part of his training course in the apostolic fathers, which means he knows that as he's teaching this, you're going to actually be reading it. And as you read it, you're going to find out this does not connect the church to the apostles. So right here, what he's doing is lowering your expectations for that. He says, actually, with some exceptions, there is not much evidence of such personal acquaintance with the apostles. So really, there's very little connection between the apostolic fathers and the apostles. It's a complete misnomer, but it's all they've got to make this connection. He goes on, he says, we must not think of the apostolic fathers as an organized group who consciously carried on the writing and teaching traditions of the apostles. Now, I want to ask you something. If the apostles intended that there should be an apostolic succession to carry forward the leadership of the Christian church as claimed, would there not be an organized group that did that? Would they not have commissioned an organized group to carry that forward, to write about it, and to see to it that that continued to be carried forward through the generations? Why is it that when we look at the best they've got in the apostolic fathers, that's completely missing? There is no evidence of apostolic succession. in these sources. Shouldn't the very fact that that is missing tell us something? That the apostles really didn't provide some kind of apostolic succession? And if that's true, what was the leadership? Well, we're going to get into that later, but I bring this up right now because as we go through this, we need to see that they're trying to make a case here with the apostolic fathers to prove something that really is not proven by the apostolic fathers and that really doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, in this source, this scholar tells us that all we've got with the apostolic fathers is a collection of fragments. Not much proof at all. Well, let's look at these sources and see what we've got. Here's a picture I'm using to represent Clement of Rome. And he was a writer. He wrote his first epistle. It's believed to be around the end of the first century, 96 to 99. This is the time period of John the Apostle, when he was still alive, near the end of his life. And Clement is known for his epistle to the church in Corinth. And according to Wikipedia, he asserts the apostolic authority of the bishops, presbyters, as rulers of the church. And it tells us this has been cited as the first work to establish Roman primacy, but most scholars see the epistle as more fraternal than authoritative. Well, the whole reason why they seize on this is because Clement was a bishop in Rome. And in the list of popes, they've included Clement as one of the popes. So therefore, they look at this letter, the Pope wrote this. Whereas if you do a reading of this letter yourself, I think you'll see that Clement is writing as one among many bishops at that time, basically sharing information with others. In this authentic epistle of Clement, 1 Clement, what he's actually explaining here is how the authority works that originates in Jerusalem. And he explains the functioning of the Hebraic form of government that had been established in every congregation of the believers by the apostles. And really, what he's explaining is exactly what you find in the New Testament. It's not something else. It's not in any way laying a foundation for the Roman Catholic Church whatsoever. However, the reason that they include Clement in the Apostolic Fathers is because there's another letter of Clement. And this other letter makes him out to support Catholic doctrine. How likely is that? Well, in 1 Clement, here's some things we learn about Clement. Clement honors Israel. Clement honors the commandments and the ordinances of the Torah. And Clement observed Torah holy days and encourages others in his book to do the same. Does that sound anything like the Roman Church to you? So actually, scholars have pretty much agreed that this other letter of Clement is spurious. In other words, a forgery that was written later to put words into Clement's mouth, making him support apostolic succession from Peter for the Roman Church. And none of that is true. Well, the next person cited among the apostolic fathers is Ignatius of Antioch. He's believed to have lived until about 117 AD, overlapping the apostles. This is a rather bizarre picture of Ignatius. He is said to be a martyr, eaten by wild beasts. And you have him here in Catholic garb. He has a pagan nimbus around his head. And, of course, all of this is from later, not from his time period. And it shows part of what I'm talking about, how the ideas of a certain generation about someone can be projected back into history and can be used to change the perception of the people about that person. Well, there's more that we can say about Ignatius. He was claimed to be the third bishop of Antioch. He was claimed to be a student of John the Apostle. And there are a series of letters with his name on them that uphold doctrines of the Catholic Church. In fact, the Catholic Encyclopedia under St. Ignatius of Antioch says this: Cardinal Newman did not exaggerate the matter when he said that, quote, the whole system of Catholic doctrine may be discovered, at least in outline, not to say in parts filled up, in the course of his 7 epistles. Now, isn't this remarkable? Before 117 AD, you have this writer, St. Ignatius, and the entire framework of the Catholic Church is in his letters. Surely that proves what I'm saying to be wrong. And here we have evidence that the Christian Church did exist. There is apostolic succession. Peter was the first pope. In fact, look at this list of doctrines. And this is only a partial list, friends. The church was divinely established as a distinct, visible society. The hierarchy of the church was instituted by Christ. The Catholicity and infallibility of the church is affirmed in the letters of Ignatius. The sacrament of the Eucharist is affirmed in these letters of Ignatius. How about this one? The supernatural virtue of virginity. And there you have the foundation for celibacy. Before 117 AD, in the letters of Ignatius. And of course, the last one is my favorite, the primacy of the See of Rome. Yes, the primacy of the Pope. That's in there too. Well, I could quit right now and say, well, I'm beaten. Here is evidence that I'm wrong, except for one thing. It's all a forgery. It was forged later in the 4th century. Now, some of it might have been written by Ignatius, updated and embellished, so to get those Catholic doctrines in there. And to make it a little more interesting, with the martyrdom of Ignatius, we actually have a post-mortem reappearance of Ignatius. Yes. So that's exciting. However, unfortunately, It's all spurious from the 4th and 5th century, not from before 117 AD. Yet, Ignatius is included among the Apostolic Fathers. Isn't that amazing? Don't you think that they would have excluded him because of all these forgeries? They can't afford to. Because if you take out Ignatius, seriously, you've got nothing left that supports them. The forgeries of Ignatius, or in Ignatius, and the forged letter of Clement are all they've got within all of this material to say what they want to say. The rest of it doesn't say it. For instance, let's look at the next man here, included among these so-called apostolic fathers. And I have to tell you, I really like this guy. This is Polycarp of Smyrna. And he was a genuine disciple of the Apostle John. He lived between 80 and 167 AD. Somewhere in there. We can't exactly pin down the dates. And he was martyred along with other believers. Let's find out some things about Polycarp. The sole surviving work attributed to Polycarp is Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. And it's not terribly long. You can find it online and read it. And when you read it, it's going to read to you a lot like possibly the letter of James in the Scriptures, or maybe the book of Hebrews, something like that. All through Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, he appeals back to the Torah, to the prophets, also to the New Testament, to the Gospels, all of that, all as one revelation. Polycarp was called a Nazarene. In his own letters, in his own letter, I should say, to the Philippians, he says, "Let us teach ourselves first to walk in the commandment." He felt we needed to know the Torah to walk in it. And Polycarp kept the biblical holy days. For example, a later historian said that he held that the 14th day of the moon, on which day the Jews were commanded to sacrifice the lamb, should be observed as the feast of the Savior's Passover. Yes, Polycarp kept the Passover, and he kept it according to the scriptural date. There's more. Polycarp was a Sabbath keeper. The letter, The Martyrdom of Polycarp, which was written by the Smyrnians. These were believers who were in this area where Polycarp was a leader. So they had been under his training, and they're reporting what happened with his martyrdom. They say that on the day of preparation, that's when the pursuers came to get Polycarp. The preparation day is the day before Sabbath. They were using that terminology. And then it tells us that Polycarp was killed on the day of the great Sabbath. So I ask you, did Polycarp and these disciples keep the Sabbath? It's clearly in the record that they did. As a matter of fact, Polycarp was a faithful Nazarene, a faithful follower of Messiah. And the work that he did in Asia continued with believers for generations. In the 3rd century, we have a writing about Elder Pionius and his companions from the same area of Smyrna. And in this reference, we see that they kept the Sabbath and they abstained from unclean foods. They kept the commandment of God. That's the reason they did it, they said. So they were all Torah keepers. So my question is, how can you cite Polycarp as being part of the Christian church when Polycarp did all the things that later on the Christian church called heretical? They threw people out of the church because they kept Passover, because they kept the Sabbath, because they kept the Torah. How is it then that Polycarp could represent them? Interesting question. Actually, Polycarp is an example for us of the Nazarenes of that era, of his lifetime, not of the Christian church. Well, then they include this rather strange work, The Shepherd of Hermas. And all I can say about this is it's bizarre. And it wasn't even written in the period that we're talking about. It was written after about 140 AD in the 2nd century. So it doesn't even represent the period we're talking about. They don't know who the author was, and it says its Christology does not seem to square with any of the Christologies of the New Testament or with those of contemporary theologians. In other words, what is said in The Shepherd of Hermas about Messiah, or Christ in the Greek, does not square with what the Christian church says, and it doesn't square with what the Nazarenes said, and it doesn't square with the New Testament. It's heresy. So why are they including heresy as part of the Apostolic Fathers? It's just strange, isn't it? As you look at this, there's nothing here that represents actual Apostolic Fathers, with the possible exception of the first letter of Clement and Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, which, if accepted, do show a link with the apostles, not to the Christian church, to the Nazarenes. Then we have one more thing. This is called the Didache. And that's Greek for teaching. It was written in the late 1st century. And friends, the best information we have shows that it really was written then, very early. And scholars say it is essentially Jewish. Here's the first line of the book. Teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles by the 12 apostles. And what this book actually seems to be is a Hebraic-based manual for new Gentile converts. And as I say, scholars view it as essentially Jewish. It is not a representative of the Christian church. We're going to look at this a little more. The first section of the Didache begins, there are two ways, one of life and one of death. And there is a great difference between these two ways. Does that sound familiar at all? Well, certainly Messiah spoke of two ways, didn't he? But he's not the one that originated the idea. The two ways is a Jewish idea that originates even before Messiah, that he was drawing on in teaching us about the narrow way. Evidence of the Jewishness of the Didache. Now, another thing that's interesting about this, where it starts out teaching about the two ways, this is very different than modern conceptions of Christianity. What Christianity very often will tell you, this is not universal in Christianity, but it's in some of Christianity, is you get saved first, and then you might think about how you live. You might not too, because really if salvation is by grace and works are bad, you're not going to think about works very much, are you? But the Didache, in talking about two ways, starts right out, preparing new converts with how they're going to walk, with how they're going to live, with works. Throughout this two ways teaching, there are many Old Testament quotes. And these are quotes also that are shared with the Gospels. The first chapter opens with the Shema, you shall love God, includes the great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, and a version of the Golden Rule. And this admonition is given. You must not forsake the Lord's commandments, neither adding nor subtracting. Now, this is a paraphrase from the Torah about the commandments of the Torah. And this is brought right in with these Gentile converts, teaching them not to forsake the commandments of the Torah. This agrees with Messiah, who said, not even one smallest letter or one tiny pen stroke shall in any way pass away from the Torah. So this is very representative of the Nazarene way of thinking, but entirely different than the Christian church way of thinking. There's more in the Didache. And really, I'm just scratching the surface to give you an idea of what's here. You could read it, and I think you'd be amazed at some of it. Concerning the Lord's Supper, the Didache says, give thanks this way. First, concerning the cup, we thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. That's the Greek pronunciation. To you be the glory forever. Now, this is interesting because here they're giving thanks for the holy vine of David that's revealed by Messiah. And so they're using this term, the holy vine of David, to at once signify the blood of Messiah, which is the blood of the covenant. But the term vine of David is talking about the house of David, the Davidic line. And it's really a veiled meaning of the Davidic covenant dynasty that Messiah established that was then leading all the believers. Why didn't they just come right out and say, well, thank you for the Davidic leadership of our group? Well, I'm thinking they didn't want the Romans to come and kill their Davidic leaders. So they didn't say it that way. But they did include that in their thinking. They're thinking like Israelites. They're thinking about the Davidic covenant here, and they're including it in this Lord's Supper commemoration. And look at this. concerning the breaking of the bread. This is the part of the prayer. Even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let your assembly be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. Well, anybody that knows the prophets would read that and think this is a clear reference to the gathering of the remnant of Israel as spoken of in all the prophets. This is in the Didache, supposedly one of the apostolic fathers. Well, just to sum this up about the Didache, this work includes a Nazarene version of a Jewish prayer. Not only does this prayer include blessing God for sustaining the universe, for his gifts of food, earth, and the covenant, by the way, but it also includes a prayer for the restoration of Jerusalem. So I ask you, is this an example of the Nazarene believers during that period or the Christian church? How do you like my little picture here? St. Paul the Jedi goes to Rome. You know, it really isn't hard to revise history. It's very interesting. As soon as you paint a picture in somebody's mind, then it changes their perception. I think it's very possible, if you ever see this statue of Peter again, you might even remember him holding this Jedi sword, even though he never did. This is what has happened with history. This is called revisionist history. One historian says, a consciously falsified or distorted interpretation of the past to serve partisan or ideological purposes in the present. Another source tells us why people do this, why they revise history. In attempting to revise the past, illegitimate historical revisionism may use techniques inadmissible in proper historical discourse, such as presenting forged documents as genuine, attributing conclusions to books and sources that actually report the opposite, and even deliberately mistranslating texts. Do we actually have revisionist history here? Is that really what we're talking about? Well, let's look at the list again of the apostolic fathers. Clement of Rome. We have an actual Nazarene letter in 1 Clement. But then we have a 4th century forgery putting words into Clement's mouth that are nothing like the Clement who wrote the Nazarene letter, totally supporting apostolic succession of Peter and the primacy of the Roman Church. Of course, it was written in the 4th century, and that's when the Catholic Church really crystallized under Constantine. And they needed to have a legitimate authority. So, forge something. Then we have Ignatius of Antioch, and his material is thoroughly corrupted with forgeries, embellishments, changes, again, to support the doctrines of the Roman Church. We have Polycarp of Smyrna, which actually, his letter is from an early date. And there's information about him that could not be obfuscated because it was already too well known, showing that he was a Nazarene Torah keeper. He kept the Sabbath, he kept the Passover, he kept the commandments, and he taught others to do the same. He is not anything like the Christian church. The shepherd of Hermas is included here, which is a heretical vision of spurious date with strange doctrines about Messiah. I think that one just got in there because they needed to have a number of these. And then finally we have the Didache. And the Didache is actually Nazarene Torah instruction for Gentiles. How could that possibly represent the Christian church? Well, as we get to the end of this presentation, we have a few questions. One is, are the apostolic fathers used to falsify history? Is this revisionist history, or does this actually show there's a connection with the apostles? Well, take the term apostolic fathers. Doesn't the term itself imply a direct connection with the apostles, if not even succession from the apostles? And then the material itself is actually lacking any such support. Isn't even the term apostolic fathers then a misrepresentation? Isn't the term itself revisionist history? Well, then we've seen that 2 Clement and the letters of Ignatius, though first claimed to be from an early date and genuine, are now seen by significant scholars as forgeries or tamperings from the 4th century, not from the time period claimed. Is this an attempt to falsify history? What else could it be? And when we look at it, we have to ask, well, why? Why did they need to produce this false literature proving an apostolic connection with the Christian church? Why did they need that? Why do they have to have these forgeries? Well, we saw that these forgeries and tamperings attempt to establish the later doctrines and authority of the Roman Church, as if originating with the apostles. Clearly, these were falsified because there are no genuine documents that prove that. So they had to supply them. So in this critical time period, the generation following the apostles, the generation where you have to have that link with the apostles, they didn't have one, and so they made stuff up. Changed history. And then we have 1 Clement, and we have Polycarp. And we have the Didache. And all of these give support to Torah keeping and to Nazarene theology, not to the theology that is associated with the Christian church. As a matter of fact, clearly, anybody that reads these documents is going to recognize in them teachings that were later on rejected by the Christian church. So, if these writers, Clement, Polycarp, and the Didache, include this admonition of Torah keeping, keeping the Sabbath, keeping Passover, and so on, and this was rejected by the Christian church, why do they point to these people as representatives of the Christian church? And if what they're trying to say by that is that these people are a connection with the apostles, wouldn't that mean that the apostles have a different doctrine than the Christian church? How does this help them? I don't see it. So why did they even include this? Well, here's their problem. These are authentic documents. They existed before the Christian church existed. They were already well known and they were well circulated. So the church couldn't forge them. They couldn't really change them. Everybody would know it. Kind of like this Jedi sword here. You look at the picture immediately, you know, oh, that's not real. Everybody would know it, right? That it's not real. So they had to include them, but their tact here is to explain away the Jewish connection. Basically saying, well, later on the church got more enlightenment, but early on they had these beliefs. So it's okay that they believe like that because back then we didn't know everything we know now. Actually, in reality, the original Nazarene movement that started with Messiah, that continued on with his family and with the apostles, did believe all these things. They did keep the Torah. They did keep the days. They did keep the commandments. And the Christian church broke away from that true movement. This is what they don't want to admit. And so they have to invent fake sources to suggest that they are the true descendants of the apostles, when really they are the descendants of the apostates. That's the truth of it. Now, this is not to condemn every Christian today as an apostate, because most of us don't know this. And any person who sincerely from the heart approaches Messiah and puts their faith in him, they're going to be saved. So this does not undermine anybody's salvation. But what happens after they're saved? If they're part of an organization, of a system that's really not from the apostles, it's really from an apostasy, a schism that happened, then can you rely on the teachings of that group? You see, this is the problem, isn't it? So people might really be saved, but then if they're putting their trust in something that really is not well-founded, then it's going to lead them into a lot of problems. And of course, doesn't this explain why the Christian church has had so many problems through the centuries? So many distortions through the centuries? Because it really doesn't have an apostolic foundation. That's really the truth of it. And you know, the actual facts of history bear out what I'm saying. The Christian church would be something very different than it is right now if it really did have an apostolic foundation. But unfortunately, it doesn't. So as we look at the picture here, what in this picture represents real historical events? And the answer, of course, is none of it. Peter was never known as St. Peter in biblical times. Of course, Peter was never a Jedi. I just thought that was kind of fun putting that in there. It does kind of help to illustrate the point, though, don't you think? And except in spurious documents, there's no record that Peter was ever in Rome. And really, why would he be, since he was an apostle to the Jews? That's what the scriptures tell us. Peter then never was the Pope, and there never was apostolic succession for the Christian church from Peter or actually from any other apostle. It's just the facts. But wait, there's still more. And I'm not talking about the Ginsu knives. Again, while personal salvation is always available to every person, so we're not undermining that. Nevertheless, the Gentile church never did have apostolic authority. And their attempt at proving that through the apostolic fathers, when you examine it, proves exactly the opposite. They cannot produce the goods to show they even existed during that time. So, if there really was no apostolic succession, providing leadership for the generation after the apostles, then what was the legitimate leadership during that period that all of this revisionist history was meant to cover up? You see, this is the problem, isn't it? If actually the Gentile church began as a schism, breaking off from the true believers, then don't they need to cover that up to be accepted? And to do that, don't they have to then obfuscate, cover over the real movement and the real leadership? So this is why they wrote these false things, these forgeries, these embellishments, to make it appear like they were the ones that had the apostolic sanction, when they didn't. Well, the people they're covering up here is the original Israelite Nazarene movement that we find in the New Testament. That's nothing like the Christian church that historically we see from their very own documents, okay, that they're claiming are the apostolic fathers. That group was keeping the Sabbath. They were keeping Passover. They were keeping the Torah commandments. That's not the Christian church, friends. That's the Nazarenes. And these Nazarenes did not move forward through the centuries under apostolic leadership. You know what? That was never the plan. The original 12 apostles are a unique group. There is no succession from them. There never was meant to be. The original Nazarenes recognized the Davidic covenant. This was restored by Messiah. And it was really the Davidic relatives of Messiah who provided the leadership moving forward after the generation of the apostles. It's this Davidic leadership that was the legitimate leadership that the later Gentile church actually abandoned and broke away from. And this is very easy to show because the thing is about the Nazarenes, they continued on. Well after the first century, that group continued on, the original group. So how could that happen? You can't say then that they became the Christian church because they didn't. They continued on. So you have to say about the Christian church that it was a schism away from that group. As a matter of fact, one of their own historians, Eusebius, from a later time when they didn't perceive the Nazarenes as a threat anymore. They didn't perceive the Despicini or the Davidic relatives of Messiah as a threat anymore, wrote about them. And this very time period we're talking about, the generation after the apostles, the end of the first century, the beginning of the second century. Speaking of them, it says, they came therefore and took the lead of every church as witness and as relatives of the Lord. Notice then who had the leadership in the assemblies. It was the Despicini, the Davidic relatives of Messiah. It goes on and says, the ecclesia up to that time had remained a pure and uncorrupted virgin, since if there were any that attempted to corrupt the sound norm of the preaching of salvation, they lay until then concealed in obscure darkness. You see, at that time, the leadership of the believers was firmly in the hands of the Despicini, who faithfully taught the scriptures. And so, even if there were apostates, they were not successful in apostatizing and leading the majority away. But it goes on and says, when the sacred college of apostles had suffered death in various forms, and then the generation of those that had been deemed worthy to hear the inspired wisdom with their own ears had passed away, then the league of godless error took its rise as a result of the folly of heretical teachers. This, friends, is the source. This is the beginning of the great Gentile schism. Well, I hope you enjoyed that message. And it leaves a lot of questions. But this is kind of detailed information, looking at a lot of historical things. So we're moving through it systematically to give you a chance to chew on it as we go ahead. In our next message, we will look at the great Gentile schism. And this is going to be very instructive because here we've shown how there really is no link between the Nazarenes and the Christian church. The great Gentile schism will tell you how the Gentile church broke away in the second century, and it will give you the details to understand what really happened. This is so important to our overall theme of restoring the assembly. It shows us kind of like a way in which things need to be reversed to get back to how everything started. So we want you to have a chance to watch all of these. You can see we have various websites where you can see these videos. So if you've missed any of them, you might want to go back and pick that up. And then we'll be moving forward with the next version in our next meeting. Let's pray together.